You're listening to the Food City Podcast, the show that takes you behind the scenes of your favorite supermarket.
From new products, expert tips on meal planning, and all things community, let's dive in and see what's in store today. All right, we are kicking off today's conversation, diving into something that is definitely pertinent for this time of year, and that is immune health. We were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, just the complexities, and there's a lot of information out there to navigate, but we really wanted to start today, of course, talking about the nutrition focus and then some of the lifestyle things we can build in to stay healthy throughout this cold and flu season.
Yep, absolutely. And I think a term or phrase that you often hear associated with immune health this time of year is boost your immune health with this food or that supplement. But in reality, we know that immune health isn't necessarily boosted. It's something that is built over time. And so your immune system, just like the name would suggest, is a complex, intricate network of different proteins and cells that all interact with each other and interact with other parts of the body. And so because of that, it is something that is built over time. And of course, nutrition plays a role in that as well. And so when it comes to specific foods that we might recommend or specific nutrients, what's your first top tip?
Ooh, I think the first thing is going back to what you said about building, not boosting. And we're going to kind of cover two sides of this today. What can I be incorporating consistently to make sure I get a good base level? And then some of that sick day, what do I do if I find myself down with symptoms? What are some things I should be reaching for? So in terms of the preventative factor, I do think vitamin D is such a big thing that we're seeing people being prescribed more supplements or their blood levels are coming back low, which is going to put you at higher risk for being maybe a little immunosuppressed. You're not going to have that normal response. So seeking out vitamin D rich foods, which in our standard American diet, the acronym is, it's SAD, because we know we're missing out on these essential nutrients. Some of my favorite in the cold winter months, I'm going to be adding in, of course, fatty fish, doing some salmon. I'm not afraid of like sardines and things, so mixing that in there. Are there other easy choices for vitamin D that you try to add in or feature in your diet?
Well, I think egg yolks are going to be a great choice. They're easy, pretty budget friendly, a great breakfast option or snack. Hard-boiled eggs make a great lunch. And I think something that we like to talk about as a kind of unique find in the produce department is UV exposed mushrooms. They're an excellent source of vitamin D. So I like including those into maybe an omelet or something first thing in the morning, soups or salads too.
Absolutely. And then fortified sources. So we're probably going to chat about vitamin C at some point today. Orange juice is something that you oftentimes see fortified with vitamin D. And then dairy items are typically also fortified with vitamin D. So if we think about that, from that, it's a fat-soluble vitamin, and it actually acts as a hormone in the body, which kind of makes it a little bit unique. So vitamin D is probably a main one because I think oftentimes people say, well, if I'm taking a supplement, do I need to be worried about dietary intake? But I really encourage people to think, if I'm recognizing I'm at risk for missing out on a nutrient, how can I get my diet in a better position to where I don't need to rely on a supplement as much? Should kind of be, again, from our dietitian perspective, a goal we would want people to work towards. And I love eggs. That's just, they're like a little, kind of like a multivitamin in food form. They are so nutrient rich and so convenient and versatile. So I love that you mentioned that with the vitamin D.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, another fat-soluble vitamin that's going to be really important for building immunity, of course, is vitamin A. And I think, especially this time of year, I think it's pretty easy to get in great sources of vitamin A. So thinking about those nice bright orange and red fruits and vegetables, and then your dark leafy greens. One of my favorite ways to incorporate that is in soups and stews that are really like soothing during the colder months.
Yes.
But what about you? What are
Sweet
your
potatoes are a huge one. Cannot get enough of them, especially again as the cold weather kind of drops. It's a nice one to add in. I think the other thing with vitamin A to keep in mind is, again, that double nutrient. We also see vitamin C rich in these food sources. So oranges have some vitamin A. And I love that we're using that color recognition, those deep red and orange tones, or normally where we're going to see that beta carotene, which we know our body can utilize or convert to that vitamin A.
Yep, absolutely. And I think another key tip, something that we know is very much related to immune health, is our gut. Our gut health kind of communicates with the immune system. And part of building a healthy gut is making sure you're eating a varied diet, especially focusing on plant-based foods that are going to offer that fiber. But a variety of all different foods, too, is going to help build or lay the foundation upon which a healthy gut can be built. It's going to, proliferate beneficial bacteria.
Yes, and I could nerd out. I could turn this whole entire podcast probably into talking about gut microbiome and gut health, but recognizing that those bacteria or kind of microcolonies communicate with our cells, right? So if we have flourishing, healthy, good microbiome, we recognize that actually is going to be part of our immune defense system. And people will take a probiotic,
right?
But I kind of say it's like throwing grass seed on asphalt. If you're not eating the right foods that bacteria then can create cultures, you're not going to see the biodiversity grow with that or change. And then prebiotics and probiotics are the other two components, which are interesting because they vary in food choices. Prebiotics are going to supply, again, some of those rich starches that feed the bacteria, and the probiotics are going to be those live cultures that we're also getting from food choices. Do you want to kind of go through some of your favorite food options to include to make sure you're covering that?
Yeah, so you mentioned prebiotic fiber. Again, that's going to be from those plant sources that we talked about. Beans, legumes, including whole grains, even onions. Just making sure that you have a variety of plant choices is a really good way to cover your bases when it comes to prebiotic fiber. And then when we think about probiotics, that kind of after you've built that solid foundation, that helps to populate the gut with beneficial bacteria. Those are going to be fermented foods. So Greek yogurt is one that we talk about often, but also sourdough bread can be a source of probiotics. Kimchi or kefir, sauerkraut even, are also going to be good sources.
And I think we're seeing more of these items appear in the grocery store. And again, it's not as maybe typical in our American diet, but recognizing some of those gaps that we're seeing can, again, put us more at risk for acute illness, like we're seeing with cold and flu season, or even more long-term disease management. So great to add those in. Another one that I like to mention for prebiotics is something called resistant starch.
Right.
And this is like the cooked and cooled method.
Potatoes.
Yeah, this works for potatoes, also works with oatmeal and things. You mentioned stews. Oatmeal is a really good choice. We think about beans and rice, but that's a great option to throw in for savory soups in the colder fall and winter months. And if you cook a big batch and then cool it, if you have beans and oats in there, you're going to get that resistant starch, which is going to have those prebiotics.
Yep. I love incorporating cooked and cooled leftover potatoes into something. I keep coming back to omelets. I guess I'm fixated on breakfast this morning. But incorporating that into an omelet, you mentioned soups. I think that's great, but also make a great topping to salads, add a little bit more flavor, some good starch for energy as well. And then, of course, you get more vitamin C, potassium, and fiber in there.
Yeah, so we've really hit on a lot of some of the bigger nutrients that we talk about. Another one that comes to mind that I think about is zinc. And when I think about zinc, I typically think about meat, seafood, nuts, and seeds, which most Americans, again, keep going back to general intake. We're eating enough protein, but sometimes it's the quality and the cuts of our protein that can impact, is it a nutrient-rich source? So are there any zinc-rich choices that you think are good to add in, again, from that, should I be eating this consistently to help build your immune health?
Well, you mentioned seafood. So I think for the majority of people, unless we're talking about an allergy or kind of maybe a specific stage of life, during, pregnancy or something like that, you can pretty much never go wrong with all kinds of different seafood choices, especially shellfish. That's going to be a good source of zinc. And then beef, of course, you mentioned that. I think lean stew beef, especially this time of year, can be a great pairing with some of those orange and dark leafy green vegetables, so you have a really complete meal.
Yeah. And again, to your point, you're hitting all of those micronutrients from a simple dish that you're putting together. The other thing that we get from meat and protein sources are B vitamins.
Right.
And especially items like B6, that's going to help support kind of the biochemical signaling of immune cells. And you mentioned this at the very beginning. We have several different types of immune cells. We have innate immunity, which is like quick responding, can help us tackle everyday things that we're exposed to out in our everyday lives. Then we have adaptive immunity. And that tends to be what happens when you actually get a virus or your body, we get something contagious exposure. That can be a response of anywhere from like 4 to 14 days, right? So the likelihood that this fall or winter, we're going to come across somebody that unfortunately has a bug that we get exposed to. So keep in mind too, your body's resiliency or ability to overcome an illness really rapidly is also a good sign of your adaptive immune health response. And these micronutrients all play different roles in how they communicate with cells. Some of them are in like the lining of like our mucosa, which is in our, our lungs and our intestines, predominantly those fat soluble ones we mentioned, vitamin D and vitamin A. But that's where I think people think if I take a multivitamin or I take a supplement, is it going to have the same impact? Right. We typically recognize that unfortunately, that isn't always going to be the number one way to get these nutrients in our body in the way which our cells are communicating to utilize them. So a question that people have a lot, if I find myself with illness, should I take a supplement? Should I take a megadose?
Vitamin C or zinc.
Yeah, and that's hard because the research that's been done, and that's what we rely on to really know how do we want people to be able to figure out what's going to work best for them, it is quite mixed.
Right.
Depends on the sample size, depends on how they're really testing it. So we don't necessarily say, yes, this is something you should do. There isn't a lot of adverse risk from doing it, but we can't say that there's a definitive benefit. I personally know a ton of people that are like, if I find myself, feeling down, I'm taking a mega dose of vitamin C, which we were talking about earlier, falls in that water soluble. Your body's utilizing it rapidly. You're losing it through fluid. So if you get a fever, urinary losses from your bowels, you're losing it. So we can understand if you're sick, you're not taking in adequate hydration or adequate nutrients, that can be something that can help buffer. But it's kind of a gray area.
Right.
It's
You're
hard to
not
navigate.
necessarily at risk for toxicity from some of those water-soluble vitamins that we're talking about. But the plus side, too, is you're probably pairing it with extra hydration, which is also really important in immune health and even, just recovery in general.
Ooh, and this might be good. Now we're kind of transitioning to if you find yourself down and out with an illness, what are some things you can add to your grocery list? What are some things to keep on hand? I do think for lots of people, they're like, my appetite kind of goes. Fatigue sets in. You're like, I don't even think about it. Keeping in mind getting these essential nutrients into your body can help make sure your immune response can, again, shorten that length of time that you're going to be experiencing symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. And just focusing on the nutrient quality and nutrient density, you may not be up to necessarily eating a full meal with lots of, vitamin D and vitamin D rich egg yolks and
you might not want a piece
beef,
of fish, right? Yeah,
exactly. But I think even for the soothing aspect of it, making sure you're hydrating, so that can be with plain water. It can be with, tea can be very soothing, but also broth is going to be a great source of hydration too. I think, a veggie heavy omelet. I keep going back to kind of some of the same ones, or a skillet dish. That's going to be a great option. What are some of your favorites?
I really think I normally want broth, more savory things. I love to put turmeric or ginger in there to kind of get some of those things that are going to help with inflammation. Especially too, I find if my palate, my nose is kind of inflamed, I can't smell a lot. Those kind of are nice aromatics that help me feel like I'm opening up my nasal passage. I like to do a lot of clear soups too. So getting some veggies like carrots, stuff that I can just toss in a pan in the morning and be like, okay, I need to rest. But these can cook down. I use our soup shortcut starters a lot, especially if I'm not feeling great, just to be like, that can do its job, get some of those micronutrients, water-soluble things in. I'm a popsicle girl too. I always kind of weirdly crave some of those. So I like to make using a little orange juice to make something that I can then have again from that soothing perspective, which I think some of these are interesting. Probably go back to like childhood, right? If, you're homesick from school or something and you have foods that are more comfort foods, but these do also have some of those essential nutrients to look out for. So we're getting vitamin C. Bone broth is something that we've seen grow in popularity. And that specifically is a type of broth where bones have been incorporated and allowed to cook down. Collagen releases. They have a little bit more protein in them, so something more substantial you could add into your grocery cart too to help get a little bit more, again, of those nutrients in.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great tip, and that's something that I probably wouldn't have necessarily thought of as for bone broth. I think it is a little bit more of an acquired taste for some. It definitely gives off, you get the savory, but it's not exactly the same as something like your standard beef broth for sure. But I also think some of those salty foods can be very comforting when you're, down with the flu or even just a cold.
Yes, and I think too the dehydration, we recognize getting those electrolytes in, like sodium can help with that. I think another thing that we think about, we've kind of gone through most of our nutrients, most of our probiotics we want to focus on. The other thing that we talk about is getting a flu vaccine. And we're lucky at Food City, we get to work hand in hand with some really talented pharmacists. We kind of ask them, let's go to the experts. Let's understand when we should be getting our flu vaccine, who maybe is top priority to be making sure you're getting that. And something that I thought I really was thinking about preparing for this, we're getting it annually, right? So there are certain vaccines that we get that last a longer period of time, but it is important to make sure you're doing it before the peak of flu season because it really is for our at-risk people. So children are eligible for the flu shot, which is great to remember because when they're in school, we know what happens at the beginning of school time. We send them out and then everyone comes home with varying illnesses across those first few weeks. So it's a great way to get that in early. Of course, women, especially pregnant women, those that are immunocompromised, important to check with your physician or doctor regarding that. And then elderly, so people over 65 and those that are caring for at-risk individuals. Those are kind of the main people that they really went through saying that's who we want to prioritize. But what we know is that we can help by reducing, most of us got our flu vaccine, that would reduce the likelihood that we are then having more chronic long-term flu season. And so we're sitting now in September. We're going to start seeing flu shots really being something that is more common starting in early September, but they will be available again, Food City pharmacies throughout this cold and flu season.
Yeah, absolutely. Important to get that first line of defense.
Yes. And the way that they work is that essentially it introduces a small amount of dead virus into your bloodstream. Your body then creates natural antibodies, and it's called a memory response. So essentially then if you get exposure to it, your body already knows how to create some of those immune cell defense, which reduces the likelihood, again, severity of illness, or you might even get off. I'm going to knock on wood maybe as we say this. I think I oftentimes find if I get it early, I end up having a better luck throughout the year. Sometimes it's like, oh, I'm going to stop by and get it. But I think that is the key for that early innate immunity, helping and assisting with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if our audience, listeners are interested in learning more about some of these key nutrients and maybe recipe inspiration, they can go to foodcity.com. And of course, always go to foodcity.com/pickwell to learn about some of those more immune supporting nutrients and better for you options.
And of course, our Food City Pharmacy, you can visit to find more from our pharmacy team, whether the flu shot is right for you this flu season, and find that in store And of course, I love sharing with you. I know we got a lot of good things today. So you can check out our Wellness Club just to get more in-depth information from both our dietitian team and our pharmacy team all year long.